Just a friendly reminder to take the quiz when you're finished watching the lecture. So, just like always, it's in the assignments folder, and it's the quiz called Gregor Mendel. So let's pull it up so you can take a preview of it. Here we go. So these are the questions that you should be looking for as you listen to the lecture. Okay, so every individual receives one set of chromosomes from their mom and one set from their dad. So that means you have two copies of every gene. But then, do you look like the gene your mom gave you or the gene your dad gave you? But maybe you have a trait that neither of your parents has. Have they been lying to you about being their child all these years? Doubtful. The genes that you get from your mom and dad interact with each other to give you your appearance. People have been wondering about how they got the features they have for ages. We used to think that traits from a person's parents simply mixed like paint. But an Austrian monk named Gregor Mendel discovered that this is not true, at least when it comes to peas. Many genes in humans are more complicated than just the simple patterns found in peas. But some are this simple, like whether or not you have dimples or a widow's peak and the shape of your earlobes, just to name a few. Gregor Mendel was a monk living in Austria in the 1800s. He was the son of a farmer, so he had always grown up with plants being a really important part of his life. So farmers like his father had been breeding plants and looking for certain characteristics in those plants to try to get the best characteristics in their crops. So Mendel did experiments like these, but he kept detailed and precise records of all of the peas he bred and the traits of their offspring. And from these records, he learned some important things about how traits are passed down. Like many great scientists, the importance of his work wasn't fully appreciated until after he died. So Mendel decided to work with pea plants in his experiments for a few important reasons. 1, they reproduce quickly. 2, they mainly reproduce by self-pollination. So it's important to remember what we saw in the lab today, that flowers are the reproductive parts of plants, and they make both male and female gametes. They can join with an egg from the same plant, so that each cell in the new plant has 2 copies of the same genes, because they essentially just have one parent. Another way to describe these peas is true breeding. That means that if the plant was allowed to reproduce using 2 gametes from itself, it would produce identical offspring to itself. This doesn't necessarily happen if a plant inherits 2 different copies of genes from their parents. So Mendel studied 7 different traits in pea plants that each had 2 varieties. The chart below shows what these traits were. For example, he noticed that when it came to flower color, peas had purple flowers or they had white flowers, never a mixture of the two and never a different color. In the same way, he noticed that peas were either green or yellow, never another color and never an in-between color, just green or yellow. Pea color and flower color are traits, and the different forms of that trait, green or yellow, purple or white, are called alleles. A gene is a segment of DNA that codes for this trait. So he started out with 2 true breeding plants and he crossed them. By crossed, I mean he took the pollen or sperm from one plant and transferred it to the other plant so that it fertilized its egg. And he called these 2 individuals the parent or the pea generation. Each time he did this, he found that the offspring looked like one parent or the other, not a mixture like he would have expected. He called these offspring the F1 generation. The F comes from the Latin word meaning brother, so F stands for filial. Then he took 2 plants from the F1 generation and he crossed them. The offspring of the F1 generation is called the F2 generation. This time he saw that the allele from the parent generation that seemed to disappear reappeared. The F1 generation he called hybrid plants because they carried the traits of both parents. He knew the F1 plants must have carried both traits or both alleles, because they were able to pass down the allele that was masked to their own offspring. So the trait that showed up in the F1 generation is called the dominant trait. It's a common misconception that dominant is always more common, but that's not necessarily true. Dominant just means that it cannot be masked. It's true that if a true breeding dominant plant is bred with a true breeding recessive plant, that within that breeding, the dominant allele is more common, like you see over on the side. Purple is dominant because it cannot be masked, and in the F2 generation, purple is more common. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if you look at the whole population, that the dominant trait is more common. Having more than 5 fingers or toes on each hand or foot is called polydactyly, and it's actually caused by a dominant allele. But I'm betting you don't know many people with extra fingers or toes. The allele that can be masked is called the recessive allele. The dominant allele is visible if an individual gets even one copy of the allele from one parent. However, in order for the recessive allele to be visible, the offspring must receive 2 recessive alleles, one from each parent. If they have the dominant appearance, it's not so easy to predict what alleles that offspring has. They may have received a dominant allele from both parents or just one. So when we do Punnett squares next, we'll learn how to predict what offspring will come from particular parents. So with purple and white flower color, P is used, or I should say capital P, is used for the purple allele since it's dominant, and lowercase or little p is used for the white allele because it's recessive. So how did I know in this situation which was dominant and which was recessive? Well, I looked at the F1 generation, and because the F1 generation has a purple plant, I know that the white color was masked. So white must be the recessive allele, and purple must be the dominant allele.